Hello, and welcome to this webinar on risk factors for LGBTQ youth. My name is Killen-Harvey. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. For the past 25 years, I've worked primarily at the Chadwick Center at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego, California, a child advocacy center, working with youth and families around issues of trauma and neglect and abuse, with a special emphasis on youth from sexual minority populations, meaning LGBTQ youth, and we'll explain some of those letters in a few moments. I'm also the co-founder of the Harvey Institute, a training and consultation company whose primary mission it is to increase client outcomes through the integration of sexual health. For today's purposes, we're going to focus on one aspect that LGBTQ youth face all the time and across the country, and that is a tremendous risk of harm. Emotional, physical, psychological. This is only one aspect of something that many LGBTQ youth are dealing with. One of the themes that I'm going to mention over and over in the short period of time that we have today, however, is to bear in mind that while it is important that those of us who are trying to outreach and service this population recognize the high degree of risk this population has for many of these issues, there is also a high degree of resiliency and support and strength within this community as well. But for today's purposes, we're just going to focus on the aspect of risk and what it is that we as professionals in the helping arena need to be focused on to provide that safety bridge for LGBTQ youth. So let's begin by just quickly differentiating sexual orientation and gender identity. I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Sexual orientation is about who we love, who we're romantically, erotically, intellectually, spiritually, socially connected to on all of those fronts, who it is that most draws us and makes us feel alive. That's our sexual orientation. And for a long period of time, we have defined that as being either heterosexual or being gay or lesbian or bisexual. Now we recognize that actually our sexual orientation has much more fluidity than even those four sort of arbitrary distinctions on the sexual orientation continuum. And that's a whole nother topic area for us to explore at another point in time. But it's important to recognize that who we're drawn to, who we love, who erotically and emotionally and sexually charges us and excites us, for many individuals is actually a quite fluid process and can change over time and can change depending upon circumstances. That's our sexual orientation. When it comes to gender identity, however, that's a whole nother ballgame. Gender identity is about how we feel in the body in which we were assigned. It is how we relate to the sexual assignment that we were given at birth. Those of us that may have been given a sexual assignment as male, does that resonate with us throughout the course of our lives, or does that change at some point in time, maybe from the beginning or maybe later on as we understand these concepts? So gender identity is about how I feel within the body that I was assigned, and does it match, is it consistent or not consistent with the sexual assignment that others have given me? So very quick overview of sexual orientation versus gender identity, but I wanted to make sure that we all had that in moving forward because they are important distinctions. And actually, in terms of risk factors, many times gay, lesbian, bisexual individuals and transgender youth experience many of the same sort of risks, but there are different risks as well related to folks that are dealing with issues around sexual orientation versus youth who may be dealing with issues around gender identity. So let's begin to talk about some of the risks that we are most aware of and that we have some science and research to lead us in a direction to say that this is an area we may want to focus on if we are interacting with LGBTQ youth in our population. This first slide I pulled up specifically because I want this to serve as sort of a foundation for the rest of the statistics that I'm going to show you. 2015, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which is designed and administered by the United States Department of Health and Human Services, added two questions related to sexual orientation, one for sexual identity and one for sexual attraction. So I want us to take a look at that. 2015, that means that only for the past 2 years has the federal government begun to even ask questions related to substance abuse, mental health, and correlation around sexual orientation. I wanted to highlight this before we move forward because it is really an underpinning of everything that we know and in many ways don't know about risk factors for LGBTQ youth. It's important for us to realize that we are still in our infancy around really understanding what this population is dealing with. We don't have a lot of great science. We don't have a lot of hard facts. We have a lot of anecdotal information. We have a lot of people's personal experiences that they've been willing and brave enough to share with us. But when it comes to cold, hard facts that we can look at over a long period of time, this is still an arena that oftentimes is not asked about. We don't ask our client populations about their sexual orientation or their gender identity, and therefore it is very difficult for us to understand exactly what they are dealing with throughout the course of their lives. So we have to keep all of the statistics that I'm about to give you right now, we need to keep them in take them with just a slight grain of salt because we are still having challenges around getting full comprehensive understanding of who this population is, partly because we don't ask, and partly because even when we do ask, because of many circumstances, some of these individuals are reluctant, hesitant, fearful of acknowledging that this is part of their experience. So our information is a bit general here. Nonetheless, what we do know so far from what we've been able to gather is that sexual minorities, that being for today's purposes people who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or questioning, were much more likely than their sexual majority counterparts to have substance abuse and mental health issues. We've seen that in the data that we've been able to track so far. When we look particularly at youth, one of the surveys that I most like to use is from the Family Acceptance Project. I will give you a connection and a link for that at the end of today's talk. The Family Acceptance Project, which looked at youth and the ways in which their health and mental health issues over the course of a lifespan were influenced by whether or not the family accepted or rejected their sexual orientation or gender identity. In that particular study, what they found was that youth who experienced even a moderate level of family rejection were about 1.5 times more likely to use illegal substances than those individuals who did not experience that rejection. And for youth who are experiencing high levels of family rejection related to their sexual orientation and their gender identity, they were 3.5 times more likely to use these substances. So there is a very high risk factor for this population right from the get-go, and a question that those of us who are working with this population need to be exploring on a continual basis with our population. Tell me about your relationship with alcohol and drugs would be one of the ways in which I would welcome that into the conversation. Depending upon what your role is, whether you're in an assessment phase or you're working as a clinician or you're working as an advocate, be mindful of the ways in which you ask these sorts of questions. We can ask questions in a way that make our client defensive or that imply that there is a certain right answer or wrong answer or that shuts our clients down from really telling us what's going on. So I always like to ask questions as much as I can in a way that is as non-judgmental as possible and is as open-ended as possible. So around substance abuse, as I mentioned to you earlier, a way I might frame that is, just tell me about your relationship with drugs. Tell me about your relationship with alcohol. It's an open-ended question, wherever the client wants to go. It doesn't stack the deck in one way or another. But I want to ask about that, and particularly for my LGBT clients, because I recognize this is an area where there may be a higher degree of risk. The next area that I wanted to take a look at in terms of risk factors in this population, and is probably the one that most people most readily identify, which is kind of good news and bad news for us. They most readily identify this related to LGBTQ youth because, quite honestly, we have the most long-term data related to this. That is the issues of depression, suicidal ideation. We have actually been looking at issues around depression and LGBTQ youth and adults for over 30 years. There have been a number of studies that have been tracking this particular risk factor. That's one of the few that we have that has that sort of longevity to it. That's good and helpful for us from a research point of view. From an advocate for this population's point of view, it's also been quite disheartening, because if you look back throughout the research, what you will find over the past 30 plus years or so is that these statistics that I'm about to share with you have really fundamentally not changed very much, even though I think many of us believe that our attitudes and the world in which LGBTQ youth are now entering is a profoundly different world than it was 30 years ago around sexual orientation and gender identity. And even though it is a different world than it was then, this remains a major risk factor for this population. 30% of all completed suicides in the United States are by LGBTQ folks. This is straight from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The rate of suicide attempts is 4 times greater for LGBT youth and 2 times greater for questioning youth than that of straight youth. That is a major, major area of concern for us that work with this population. And again, a number that hasn't fundamentally changed or decreased over time, when one would have intuitively thought that it should, given that we have seen a change overall somewhat in national attitudes around sexual orientation and gender identity. How I like to try to put this together in my own head, and this is strictly my take on this, is that even though there may have been some broad societal shifts in our attitude around this population, the process of coming out as a gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, questioning individual is still an incredibly personal process and experience. So on some levels, it doesn't matter what's happened nationally or internationally. It doesn't matter what's happened in the Supreme Court. It doesn't matter what's happened or the attitude of the White House in one way. What matters is what's happening in the family that I'm born into, the community that I'm living in right now, the school that I have to go to day as an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old. That has much more impact on me day to day. And in many cases for LGBTQ youth, the attitudes there at that micro level have really not changed all that much. And so the concept of depression and suicidal ideation is something I want all of us to sort of be aware of. Another distinction here, again, to just clarify about what we know and why we know things and what we don't know. As you'll see in that first statistic on this slide, it says that 30% of all completed suicides in the U.S. by GLBTQ. The next one says that the rate of suicide attempts is 4 times greater for LGB youth. You will see this kind of moving back and forth. The T gets dropped at times, the Q gets dropped at times. Again, because our research isn't comprehensive and isn't consistent, we have some understanding sometimes of some aspects of this community and not of other aspects. So we may know some things about certain gay, lesbian, bisexual youth. We may know certain things about trans youth. We may know certain things about all of those youth. But it's important to kind of, if you're going to be looking in these arenas, to be clear in terms of what population was surveyed, how did they access them, how were the questions asked. Just to add to that, 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt, an incredibly high number. 92% of them reporting that the attempt happened before the age of 25. So again, those of us working with adolescents or TAY youth, transitional age youth, this is an area, particularly for our transgender clients, that we want to be constantly taking a look at. Those of you that use standardized assessment measures, incorporating a depression inventory screen with your clients would be very important for this population. Or asking questions, again, in a more general way. For young people around issues of depression and suicidal ideation, some of the ways that I try to approach that to make it a little bit more comfortable conversation. I will say to a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old, tell me where you imagine yourself being a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. Now, young people can go all over the place with that kind of question. Some have no idea, and they'll say, I don't know where I want to be, I just want to get through high school, or I just want to get out of my house. Or other youth may have lofty, I want to be president, or I want to be an astronaut, or I want to be an engineer, or whatever it is. The youth I'm concerned about, particularly the LGBTQ youth I'm concerned about, are the youth that when I ask that question, give me a blank stare. And it's not a blank stare because I'm not quite sure where I want to be 5, 10, 15 years from now, in terms of a professional career or even where I want to live. I don't imagine being here 5, 10, 15 years from now. I'm not thinking that far ahead in my life. I'm barely able to make it through today. When a client really can't understand that question, really looks puzzled by a question about their future, it may be because they don't imagine a future. And those are the youth I really want to start focusing in on and paying more attention to. So that's just a suggestion of a way to sort of do an informal screen around potential issues of depression and suicidal ideation. Sexual abuse. This is an interesting area for me, and this is my background and where I come from. This is what I've done for a long period of time, is to look at this correlation. We're just beginning to understand whether or not LGBTQ youth may be at higher risk of sexual abuse than their heterosexual peers, and quite honestly, we're still not quite sure. We don't have enough data to really tell us that. I have some statistics here, but they still don't give us a lot of good information on whether or not there's a higher degree of risk. It certainly doesn't look like there's a lower degree of risk. And we know that roughly 1 in 6 boys and 1 in 4 girls at some point in their lives will have experienced some sort of non-consensual exploitive sexual experience. We believe that it is probably the same for LGBTQ youth and maybe perhaps slightly higher. But again, we're not quite sure yet. What we do know is that sexual abuse is a difficult issue for any client to acknowledge, for youth in particular to acknowledge. That's just generally true. Add another degree of challenge to that for LGBTQ youth because of the circumstances surrounding it. If, for example, the sexual abuse happened and it involved a same-sex sexual perpetrator of the abuse, an LGBT or questioning youth may be reluctant to disclose the sexual abuse, not just because of the general feeling of shame that often accompanies that experience for youth, but also the concern of, will this raise a visibility about my orientation, or possibly raise that question. So in essence, many times LGBTQ youth feel like disclosing an inappropriate sexual interaction with somebody else in some ways is outing themselves. Even though I didn't want it, even though I didn't welcome it, the fact that I was involved in a sexual experience with somebody of the same sex, even if I was not complicit in that in any way, but if I acknowledge that, then somebody is going to probe into who am I and may find out that I'm gay or lesbian or bisexual or questioning. And that is a second layer that keeps these youth many times from disclosing what happened or denying it when it's found out by somebody else. So very tricky terrain for us to have to sort of navigate for LGBTQ youth around this concept of sexual abuse. A couple of other things in terms of risk factors. This was from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, again done by the federal government. Around physical and emotional abuse, we see some numbers here about the degree of bullying that LGBTQ youth face, most often in their school environment, also in the electronic, digital, social app world as well. Many youth we now recognize are exposed to bullying. That is something that we have begun to focus on as a country and as a nation in the past 10 years or so. But we believe even within that, even though we are now recognizing that it may be a somewhat universal risk factor for adolescents, LGBTQ youth probably are experiencing it at an even higher rate than others. Again, important part of a conversation you want to be having with your clients about whether this is happening for them or not. These are the kinds of issues that many times youth are reluctant to talk about. They feel shame and embarrassment about it and are worried to talk about it, and yet keep it internalized, and it starts to continue to chip away at that sense of who they are and the sense of self, which then leads to the depression and the suicidal ideation and the substance abuse that we talked about earlier. You can kind of see how this all sort of plays out. These layer upon layer of messages from the broader world of you're not okay, you're not normal, you're not part of the rest of us. Those kinds of messages have profound implications, but they often start with sort of small kind of hits to the sense of self-esteem, but they add up and accumulate over time. Homelessness is another area that we have some good data on and have been tracking for a relatively long period of time. Depending upon the survey, depending upon where it's asked, how the question is asked, the population in particular, but you will find research showing anywhere from 40 to 60% of youth who are living on the streets, youth who are homeless, will identify that the primary reason, or one of the primary reasons, they can no longer live in their home or in their original community has something to do with either their sexual orientation or their gender identity. 40 to 60%. That's a high number for a population that is quite high. We actually have a large number of youth that live on the streets these days or in homeless shelters, but not in a primary family home or environment. So homelessness is a major issue, and the resources for LGBTQ youth actually are lacking all across the country. There are very few communities that actually have specific resources for homeless LGBTQ youth. And there are some different resources that they need related to that issue. Many times our homeless youth are reluctant to access the services that are available for homeless youth within their community because they experience the same degree of bullying, discrimination, sort of abuse within the homeless agency or shelter that they experienced at their home. And it's like, well, the heck with this, I'm out of here as well. So we've got a lot more work to do around addressing the needs of homeless LGBTQ youth. School environments, as we get near the end of our talk today, school environment where most of our youth spend most of their time. There's a great organization called GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Educators Network. It's a national, actually international organization of teachers, educators, school board members, parents, community members that are interested in creating safer environments for LGBTQ youth in schools across the country and across the world. They do a survey every few years and ask students what their experiences are on their high school and elementary school campuses. And this is from one of the surveys that was done recently. About 75% or so of LGBT students reported being verbally harassed because of their sexual orientation. 55% of them because of their gender expression. And these generally tend to be the youth who are most out that are able to report this. So we know that those youth that aren't out, that are reluctant to being out, actually probably experience some of this stuff, sometimes in even higher numbers, but they're not able to tell us because that outs them further. 30% of these students reported missing at least one day of school in the past month because of feeling unsafe. And so we do believe also for this population, there is a higher degree of school dropout because schools become an unsafe environment for these youth. There are many communities that are struggling with this and trying to find the appropriate way to respond. In the past, one of the ways that it was responded to was by setting up special schools just for LGBTQ youth. I will own my own personal thing on that approach. While I appreciated it and understood what they were trying to do, I think we missed the boat when we say in order for an LGBTQ youth to successfully complete high school, we have to create a special high school for them. I think we have to go back and say why are our high schools not safe for all students to attend. That's a bigger issue that we still have to address, and we don't address it by siphoning those kids out and moving them somewhere else. So as we wrap up, I want to point you to a couple of things to take a look at. The Family Acceptance Project, which I alluded to at the beginning of the talk. There is a link for it at the end that I'll show you in a moment. Some great work that shows the ways in which family rejection heightens some of these risk factors that we were just talking about, and also talks about the importance of family acceptance, that if we can get families to shift the ways in which they begin to approach their family members around sexual identity and sexual orientation, even shifting just a little bit will make a big influence and reduce the risk of many of these risk factors for LGBTQ youth. One of the things that the study also shows us, however, is in the absence of family acceptance. If we really have a family that is so rejecting around their family members' sexual orientation or gender identity, and there's just no movement nor willing to even look at that issue, that does not mean that young person is now doomed to all of these other risk factors. In the absence of family acceptance, other caretakers or adults can actually have a big impact as well, and that's where we come in. So when we have a highly rejecting family, then we in the helping professions have an added responsibility and opportunity to help these kids avoid some of these negative risk outcomes over time by showing our ability to accept, validate, and help these youth move on to a full integrated life that they deserve. So you want to take a look at your resources in your own community, make sure you know who they are, how they operate, whether or not they've specifically worked with LGBTQ youth in the past, not just that they're comfortable taking these youth as their clients. How much work have you done in the past? How much training has your organization done? Utilize folks in the community that know these resources that are from the LGBT community as your experts in the field. So it's a good way to kind of figure out who I'm going to refer to. A couple of resources for you at the end: the Trevor Project, 24-hour a day, 7 days a week hotline, and then all the other related social media ways to contact it for LGBTQ youth who may be depressed or suicidal. So it's an amazing organization and a great resource for our youth. The Trevor Project. We've got the Human Rights Campaign, Child Welfare League, and National Center for Lesbian Rights, all major LGBTQ advocacy organizations that do a lot of work around youth in particular and resourcing. So there are websites related to all of them. Family Acceptance Projects, which we've already talked about. Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, which is an international organization, a support organization for parents who are dealing with the fact that somebody in their family is gay, lesbian, bisexual, and or transgender. And it's a great organization and has a wonderful website with a lot of resources on it. GLSEN we've already talked about, and then the Gay Straight Alliance, which coordinates gay straight alliances in high school and college campuses all across the United States, and that's a great resource to be aware of as well. And so that brings us to the end. I want to end with a reminder again that today's talk was specifically focused on risk factors for this population, and there are many others as well, but those are the ones that I chose to just highlight for today's purposes. But I want all of us to remember that there's only one aspect of the complexity of who these youth are, and that we need to also be looking at their strengths, at the resources that they're able to access and to move forward, and to recognize that not every individual who is LGBTQ youth has to deal with all of these, and that these risk factors are clearly a reflection of the ways we respond to youth. It is not their fault that they're dealing with this. It's our fault collectively that we've put them in an environment where that has had to be their response to societal's attitude about who they are. So I hope this has been a little bit helpful in looking at some of those issues, and I look forward to a further conversation related to this as we move forward. Thank you so much.